For 5 years, every doctor told me the same thing. You're just tired. It was stress. It was anxiety. It was menopause. And I believed them. I almost gave up on myself. But the truth was hiding, growing silently inside me. A truth so terrifying that when my own son first saw it, he fainted. This isn't a story about being sick. This is the story of how I learned to fight to be heard, even when my own voice was just a whisper. My life before the fog felt like it belonged to another woman. I see her in faded photographs, a vibrant person with light in her eyes. I remember the feeling of purpose, the boundless energy that propelled me through long days at my architecture firm and into evenings filled with family. My garden was my sanctuary, the rich smell of damp earth after a rain, a kind of therapy. I was the planner, the fixer, the steady center of our family's orbit. Life wasn't just lived. It was devoured with an appetite I thought would never fade. I was the glue, holding everything together with an effortless strength. That strength was a currency I spent without a thought, assuming my accounts were infinite. My career was demanding, but it was a passion. I loved the clean lines of a blueprint, the challenge of transforming a client's abstract dream into a physical structure of concrete and glass. My mind was sharp, a well-oiled machine that thrived on details and deadlines. I could work a 10-hour day, cook a family dinner, help with homework, and still have energy left over. This woman, this version of me, never imagined a day when simply climbing a flight of stairs would feel like summiting a mountain. Looking back, I see that I took my own vitality for granted. It was as essential and unnoticeable as the air I breathed. My body was a reliable vehicle that always started, always got me where I needed to go. I never questioned it. I never thought to be grateful for the simple miracle of clarity, of a mind unclouded by a persistent, heavy haze. But a silent thief was already at work inside of me, slowly and methodically draining that precious energy, one drop at a time. I was living on borrowed time, completely unaware that the loan was about to come due with devastating interest. The first crack in that perfect facade was almost imperceptible. I was at my desk, staring at a complex design on my monitor. I blinked once, twice. For a split second, the sharp black lines on the screen wavered, blurring into a soft gray. I shook my head, a small, reflexive action to clear it. I blamed the long hours, the strain on my eyes. It was nothing. It was just a reminder to take a break, to drink some water. I stood up, stretched, and when I sat back down, the lines were sharp again. I dismissed the incident completely, never guessing it was the first tremor before a seismic shift. A few months later, the whisper grew louder. I was in the sterile brightness of the supermarket, pushing my cart down the cereal aisle. A wave of exhaustion washed over me so suddenly, so completely, that my knees buckled. I gripped the handle of the cart to keep from falling, my knuckles white. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed to hum with an aggressive intensity, and the cacophony of beeping scanners and distant conversations melted into a disorienting roar. It felt like the world had been turned up too loud, while a thick blanket was simultaneously being pressed down over my head, muffling my own thoughts. A hot flush of shame and panic ran through me. What was happening? I looked around, terrified that someone had seen my moment of weakness. A grown woman clinging to a shopping cart like a life raft. I felt a profound sense of wrongness, a fatigue so deep it felt like it was in my bones, dragging me down. It was a cellular exhaustion, a fog descending not just on my body, but on my mind. When I finally made it home, my husband, Mark, noted my pallor. I forced a smile and told him I felt a cold coming on. It was the first of many lies I would tell, not just to him, but to myself. That lie felt necessary, a small shield against a terrifying unknown. Admitting the depth of my exhaustion felt like admitting failure. So, I began to build a fortress of denial around myself. I started making small concessions, tiny retreats from the life I once knew. I canceled a dinner with friends, blaming a looming work deadline. My weekly yoga class, once a source of renewal, became an insurmountable effort. I started delegating tasks at work. Projects that once excited me now felt like heavy burdens. My world was slowly, quietly shrinking, and I was the one pulling the drawbridge up. The battle inside my head was constant. One part of me, a small, frightened voice, insisted that something was terribly wrong. But a louder, more critical voice shouted it down. "You're just getting older, Lena. This is what happens. Stop being lazy. Push through it." I started relying on caffeine, then on sugary energy drinks that left a bitter, chemical taste in my mouth. I was trying to mask the symptom, to artificially fuel the engine, refusing to acknowledge that the engine itself might be broken. The fear of being truly sick was so immense that I preferred to believe I was simply weak. My son, Leo, was home from college for the summer, and his sharp eyes missed nothing. He watched me, his expression a mixture of confusion and concern. He saw me dozing off in a chair in the middle of the afternoon, saw the way my hands trembled slightly as I poured my third cup of coffee. One evening, as I stared blankly at the television, he said quietly, "Mom, you seem absent. You're here, but you're not really here." His words pierced through my carefully constructed denial. The problem wasn't just something I felt on the inside. It was visible. It was real enough for someone else to see. His observation was the push I needed. I finally made an appointment with my family doctor, Dr. Martins. I sat in the crowded waiting room, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and quiet coughs, rehearsing my symptoms in my head. I wanted to sound rational, not hysterical. In his office, I tried to explain the crushing fatigue, the brain fog that made finding the right word a struggle, the occasional dizzy spells. He listened, or seemed to, but his eyes were fixed on his computer screen, his fingers clicking away at the keyboard in a steady, dismissive rhythm. My hope began to drain away with every click of that keyboard. I felt so vulnerable, trying to articulate a feeling as all-encompassing as a fog. I feared he saw me as just another tired, overworked, middle-aged woman complaining. "Please," I thought, "please just look at me. Please take this seriously." He asked a few perfunctory questions about my sleep schedule, my stress levels at work. I felt like a set of checkboxes on a form, not a person in distress. The cold paper on the examination table felt as impersonal as his questions, mirroring the chill that was creeping into my heart. Before I could even finish describing the visual disturbances, he cut me off. "Elena, you're 48 years old, you have a demanding job, a family. It sounds like a classic case of burnout." He spoke with a practiced, reassuring tone that didn't feel reassuring at all. It felt like a dismissal. "I'll order some routine blood work, thyroid, iron levels. The usual, but I'm sure everything will come back normal. You probably just need a good vacation." He had reached his diagnosis before a single test was run. My 5-month-long struggle had been evaluated and invalidated in less than 10 minutes. A week later, a nurse called. Her voice was brisk, efficient, clearly on to her next task before she'd finished with mine. "Hi, Elena. Your blood work came back. Everything is normal. Dr. Martin suggests you focus on improving your sleep hygiene and perhaps consider some stress management techniques." She said the word normal as if it were a full stop, the end of the conversation. I murmured a thank you and hung up the phone. The finality of her tone echoed in the silent kitchen. The world of medicine had given its verdict. There was nothing wrong with me. The results should have been a relief, and for a fleeting moment, they were. I didn't have cancer. I didn't have some terrible, life-threatening disease discoverable by a blood test, but that relief was quickly swallowed by a profound and suffocating despair. If the tests were normal, then what was the problem? The only possible conclusion was that the problem was me, my mind, my lack of willpower. Was I imagining it all? Was I just too weak to handle the normal pressures of life? The medical system hadn't given me answers. It had just amplified my deepest fears about myself. I tried to follow the advice. I forced myself to go to bed earlier, downloaded a meditation app, and even booked a weekend away with Mark. Nothing touched the exhaustion. It was a leaden cloak I couldn't shrug off. The symptoms began to evolve, to sharpen. The vague fog in my head was now accompanied by sharp, pulsating headaches that seemed to start behind my right eye. At night, the headlights of oncoming cars would bloom into blinding, starburst-like patterns, forcing me to grip the steering wheel until my knuckles ached. I started making excuses to avoid driving after dark. The fear, which had once been a vague unease, now became a constant, living presence. It sat with me at dinner. It lay beside me in bed at night. It was no longer a fear of being sick, but a terror that there was something insidious growing or changing inside me, something that science couldn't see and doctors wouldn't look for. I felt utterly alone, trapped inside a body that was slowly, inexplicably, failing me. The hope I had carried into Dr. Martin's office was gone, replaced by a grim, creeping resignation that this was just my life now. The creeping nature of the illness made it easy for others to miss, but the small changes were adding up. During a family dinner, I was telling a story and meant to say television, but the word refrigerator came out of my mouth instead. I corrected myself quickly, and everyone laughed it off as a funny slip of the tongue. But I saw the look in Leo's eyes across the table. His smile faded. He didn't see a simple mistake. He saw another piece of evidence, another data point in a terrifying trend. It wasn't just a slip. It was a glitch in my wiring, and he was the only one who seemed to notice. Pushed by Leo's persistent worry, I secured a referral to an endocrinologist, Dr. Wallace. We were both convinced it had to be a thyroid issue that the basic tests had missed. His office was a stark contrast to Dr. Martin's modern clinic. It was paneled in dark wood and smelled of old paper and leather-bound books. Dr. Wallace himself was an older man with an air of impatient authority. He glanced at my file for no more than 30 seconds. "Your TSH is within the normal range," he declared, tapping the paper. "A little low, perhaps, but nothing to write home about." I tried to explain again, to convey the sheer weight of my symptoms, but I could feel his attention drifting. He was looking at me, but he was categorizing me, not listening to me. "You're at an age, Alina," he said, his voice laced with a weary condescension, "where hormonal fluctuations can cause a wide range of symptoms: fatigue, mood swings, brain fog. It all sounds like perimenopause to me." The word hung in the air, another label, another box to put me in. It was a simple explanation that neatly dismissed the terrifying complexity of what I was experiencing. The office felt suffocating, the air thick with the certainty of a man who had seen it all and was no longer curious. The slow, steady tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the corner seemed to be counting down the minutes of my life that I was losing to this invisible illness. I felt my frustration turning to a quiet rage. This man, in his dark wood fortress, had decided my fate based on my age and gender. It was easier to blame my hormones than to admit that he didn't have an answer. He was a gatekeeper, not a guide. He scribbled a prescription on his pad and pushed it across the desk. "I'll start you on a low-dose hormone replacement therapy. Give it a few months. If that doesn't help, I'd suggest you explore the psychological component of this." The implication was clear. If the hormones didn't fix me, then I was broken in a way he couldn't treat. I left his office with the small piece of paper in my hand, but I felt heavier than when I had arrived. I was being sent down another wrong road, a detour that would cost me more precious time. 6 months later, the hormone therapy had done nothing. In fact, the headaches were worse, and I'd developed a persistent, low-grade nausea. I went back to Dr. Martin's, who now seemed convinced that Dr. Wallace's final suggestion was the correct path. He referred me to a psychiatrist, Dr. Chen, framing it as a positive step towards managing my physical manifestations of stress. The appointment with her felt different. She listened patiently for a full hour, her office bright and airy, filled with plants and sunlight. But every question was about my mood, my childhood, my marriage, my job stress. My physical symptoms were treated as secondary, as metaphors for an underlying sadness. A part of me was desperate to believe she was right. A diagnosis of depression or anxiety felt manageable. It was a known entity, something with a clear treatment path. It felt far less terrifying than the nameless, shapeless thing I was truly afraid of. But my gut, my deepest instinct, screamed in protest. The pressure behind my eyes wasn't a metaphor. The weakness in my limbs wasn't a manifestation. It was real. I felt like I was on trial, and my own body was the unreliable witness whose testimony was being systematically discredited. Dr. Chen was kind, but firm in her diagnosis. She prescribed an SSRI, a common antidepressant. "Let's try this for a few months," she said gently. "It will help lift the depression, which should, in turn, alleviate your physical symptoms. They are often more connected than we realize." I nodded, too exhausted to argue anymore. I took the prescription, a silent admission of defeat. I had started this journey seeking a physical cause, and had ended up with a psychiatric label. I had been systematically redefined, not as a person with a mysterious illness, but as a person whose mind was making her body sick. The first few weeks on the antidepressant were brutal. A constant low-level nausea settled in my stomach, and I walked around in a detached, dreamlike state. The promised relief never came. The bone-crushing fatigue remained. One afternoon at work, I made a catastrophic error, transposing a series of crucial measurements on a structural blueprint. It was a rookie mistake, the kind of thing I hadn't done since I was an intern. My boss, a man who had always valued my precision, called me into his office. His face was etched with a concern that felt dangerously close to disappointment. The error was caught in time, but the damage to my confidence was done. My professional identity, the part of me that was competent and reliable, was beginning to fracture. The office, once a place of creativity and achievement, now felt like a minefield of potential failures. I reread every email 5 times. I double-checked every number until my eyes burned. The effort it took to simply function at a basic level was immense. My boss's suggestion that I consider a medical leave of absence, meant kindly, felt like a judgment. It confirmed my greatest fear. I was no longer capable. I was losing the part of myself that I had worked so hard to build. This slow-motion collapse began to poison my life at home. Mark tried his best to be supportive, but my illness was invisible, my suffering abstract. There were no casts, no scars, nothing for him to see. There was only a wife who was perpetually tired, who could no longer engage with life in the way she used to. His well of patience, once seemingly bottomless, was running dry. One evening, after I turned down his suggestion for a simple walk, his frustration boiled over. "Alina, I don't get it," he exclaimed, his voice raw. "Every doctor says you're fine. It feels like you don't even want to get better." His words struck me with the force of a physical blow. The one person I thought was in my corner now sounded like just another voice of doubt. He couldn't see the war I was fighting every single day just to get out of bed. He couldn't understand that my no wasn't a choice, but a surrender to a body that had reached its absolute limit. In that moment, I had never felt more alone. As he stood with his back to me, the shoulders of a stranger, the room began to tilt. A wave of dizziness, sharper and more violent than ever before, forced me to grab the kitchen counter to steady myself. He never even noticed. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. I found myself in the blue glow of my laptop screen at 3 in the morning, typing my strange collection of symptoms into a search bar. It was a desperate act, a digital cry for help. I fell down a rabbit hole of medical forums and patient support groups, online worlds populated by the medically unexplained. For hours, I read stories from people all over the world, their words echoing my own experience with an eerie, heartbreaking familiarity. They wrote of the same crushing fatigue, the same brain fog, the same dismissive doctors. A strange and contradictory mix of emotions washed over me. There was the profound, soul-deep relief of validation. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't alone. These symptoms were real, and other people had them, but that validation was followed by a wave of pure terror. Their stories were filled with frightening dynastic odysseys, tales of misdiagnosed cancers, autoimmune disorders, and rare neurological conditions. In one post, a woman described her years of unexplained pressure headaches and cognitive dulling. For years, she was told it was migraines and depression, until one neurologist finally ordered an MRI. The word neurologist lit up on the screen, a beacon in the darkness of my despair. The 4th anniversary of the fog's arrival came and went. It wasn't a date I marked on the calendar, but my body kept the score. For years, 1,460 days of my life had been lost to this pervasive grayness. My family tried to celebrate my birthday, but their forced cheerfulness only highlighted the chasm between the woman I was and the ghost I had become. I sat on the sofa, wrapped in a blanket, and smiled for their pictures. But the effort was Herculean. The vibrant glow of the birthday candles seemed to mock the dimness I felt inside. I was a spectator at my own life. Leo watched me with an unnerving intensity. He was no longer a boy home from college. He was a young man on the cusp of his own life, and he was watching his mother fade away. His gaze was a physical weight, filled with a helpless love and a growing fear that I knew mirrored my own. I saw in his eyes a desperate calculation, a search for a solution that no one had been able to provide. He was witnessing the slow, quiet theft of my personality, my vitality, my very essence, and he was utterly powerless to stop it. That powerlessness was perhaps the cruelest symptom of all. Later that evening, as I pushed myself up from the sofa to go to bed, my left foot caught on the edge of the rug. It wasn't a dramatic fall, it was a clumsy, undignified crumple. Mark rushed to help me, chiding me gently about the dim lighting, but it wasn't the light. My leg hadn't responded. For a split second, the message from my brain to my foot seemed to have gotten lost in transit. As Mark helped me to my feet, I looked over his shoulder and met Leo's eyes. There was no dismissal in his expression, only a new, sharp, and terrifying clarity. We both knew it wasn't just a stumble. That fall prompted another visit to Dr. Martin's. By now, my file was a thick, heavy testament to years of dead ends and normal test results. I told him about the fall, the momentary lack of response from my leg, the worsening headaches. He listened with a weary patience, his pen making a few notes on my chart. He sighed, a sound of deep, professional fatigue. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me, not with curiosity, but with a kind of sad finality. The look on his face told me he had reached the end of the road with me, and we hadn't gotten anywhere. "Alina," he said, his voice soft but firm, "we have run every test, we've explored every avenue. There is nothing physically wrong that we can find." He folded his hands on his desk, a gesture of closure. "I think, at some point, we have to consider that this might just be your new normal. Perhaps it's time to focus on acceptance and coping strategies." His words were meant to be therapeutic, but they landed like a death sentence. To accept this was to accept a life half-lived. To accept this was to surrender. To accept this was to die while my body was still breathing. For the first time in 5 years, the fog of exhaustion was burned away by a flash of white-hot rage. He wasn't my partner in health. He was a gatekeeper to it, and he had just locked the gate. I stood up, my legs trembling with adrenaline. "My new normal," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. "I am disappearing in front of your eyes and you want me to accept it. No, if you won't help me, I will find someone who will." I walked out of his office without looking back, the slam of the door behind me a satisfying punctuation to 5 years of quiet desperation. Weeks later, the illness declared itself in a way that could no longer be ignored or reinterpreted. I was at home, trying to read, when a strange smell filled the air. It was acrid and chemical, like burning rubber. I asked Mark if he smelled it, but he just looked at me, confused. The smell was only for me. And then it happened. A tingling, like 1,000 tiny electric pins, started on the right side of my face, spreading from my cheek to my lip. I brought my right hand up to my face, and was horrified to see it trembling. A small, violent tremor I couldn't control. It lasted maybe 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. This was different. This wasn't fatigue. This wasn't brain fog. This wasn't a subjective feeling that a doctor could dismiss as stress. This was a physical event, a neurological misfiring that was terrifyingly concrete. The fear was no longer a vague dread, but a sharp, specific terror. Stroke, seizure, tumor, the words that had lurked in the darkest corners of my mind now screamed for attention. I didn't tell Mark. I couldn't bear to see the fear in his eyes, could unbear the thought of a frantic trip to the emergency room only to be sent home again. But I called Leo. The 3-month wait for the neurology appointment was a special kind of torture. With the new, frightening symptoms, every day felt like a gamble. My condition deteriorated rapidly. Most days I didn't have the energy to leave my bed. The brain fog was so thick I would lose my train of thought mid-sentence. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, in my own body. I would look at old photographs of myself smiling, energetic, alive, and weep for the woman I had lost. Hope was a dying ember, and I was terrified that it would be extinguished completely before I ever got an answer. Leo, however, refused to let that happen. He saw me withering and channeled his fear into action. He became my warrior. Every single morning, he would call the neurologist's office. "Hi, I'm just checking to see if there have been any cancellations for my mother Alina." He was polite but relentless. He began to subtly exaggerate my symptoms to the receptionist, his voice laced with a convincing urgency. "She's having significant memory lapses," he'd say. Episodes of confusion. It was an act of loving desperation. A fight to get me seen before there was nothing left of me to see. His persistence, or perhaps the receptionist's pity, finally paid off. On a Tuesday afternoon, the phone rang. It was the clinic. "We've had a last-minute cancellation for tomorrow morning at 9. Can you make it?" Leo burst into my bedroom, his face flushed with a triumphant relief that cut through my lethargic haze. "Mom, we're in. Tomorrow." The news was a jolt of adrenaline and terror. Tomorrow. It was so soon. I felt a surge of the old fear. What if this is just another disappointment? But then I looked at my son's determined face, and I found a strength I thought was long gone. I would go. The neurologist's office was clean, modern, and blessedly quiet. We were called back to see a Dr. Eris. She was young, with a kind, intelligent face. When she entered the room, she didn't walk to the computer. She pulled up a small stool, sat directly in front of me, made eye contact, and said, "Okay, Alina, tell me everything. Start from the very beginning, and don't leave anything out. No matter how small or strange you think it is." For the first time in 5 years, a doctor was looking at me, truly looking at me, and inviting me to speak. The simple act of being seen, of being offered the gift of time and undivided attention, was so overwhelming that I almost began to cry. A wall I had built inside myself began to crumble, and so I talked. I told her everything. The first blurry moment at my desk, the exhaustion in the supermarket, the dismissals, the labels of stress and anxiety. I told her about the phantom smell of burning rubber and the terrifying tremor in my hand. I spoke for nearly 45 minutes, uninterrupted. She just listened, her pen occasionally scratching a note on a paper pad, her eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, the silence in the room was not empty, but full of consideration. Dr. Eris nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "Alina, thank you for sharing all of that. I know it wasn't easy." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Your symptoms, especially the combination of the long-term cognitive changes with these new, focal neurological events, that worries me." The word worries was the most validating and terrifying thing I had heard in half a decade. My fear wasn't baseless. It was justified. It was real. She then began a thorough neurological exam, explaining each step as she went. "I'm just going to test your reflexes now," she'd say in her calm, even voice. She had me walk a straight line, heel to toe. She tested the strength in my arms and legs, pushing against them and asking me to resist. She shone a bright light into my eyes, watching my pupils react. Each test felt monumental, a passful exam on the state of my own brain. I was acutely aware of my body's every response, praying it wouldn't betray me, or rather, that it would betray the truth of my illness. I could see her focus intensify as she worked. She ran a small, pointed object along the soles of my feet. She had me close my eyes and identify which finger she was touching. There was no dismissal, no rush. It was a methodical, careful search. At the end, she looked at me, her brow furrowed in concentration. "There is a very subtle, but definite, weakness on your left side, and your reflexes are just a fraction slower there as well. It's not something you'd notice in your daily life, but it's here." She had found it. Objective, physical proof. I wasn't imagining things. She went back to her desk and picked up a prescription pad, but it wasn't for a medication. "I don't want to alarm you," she said, her voice steady, "but we need to see what's going on inside your head. I am ordering an MRI of your brain, with and without contrast. And I want you to get it done as soon as possible." She wrote the order, and then she underlined the word urgent twice. That single, underlined word contained both my greatest fear and my greatest hope. The validation was absolute. My condition was real enough, serious enough, to warrant this. Leo, who had been silent throughout the exam, finally spoke, his voice tight with anxiety. "What do you think it could be?" Dr. Eris met his gaze directly, her expression compassionate but unyielding. "I don't want to speculate. That wouldn't be fair to any of us. The scan will give us the answers we need. Call the imaging center as soon as you leave here." Her refusal to guess was more frightening than any possible diagnosis she could have offered. The unspoken possibilities seemed to fill the air in the small room, heavy and suffocating. 2 days later, I was lying on a narrow platform, being slid into the tight, white tube of an MRI machine. The technician placed headphones over my ears, but they did little to muffle the deafening, industrial clamor that started moments later. A chaotic symphony of bangs, whirs, and percussive thuds echoed around me, vibrating through my bones. I closed my eyes and tried to focus on my breathing, fighting back a wave of claustrophobic panic. For 5 years, the problem was hidden. Now, this monstrous machine was going to hunt for it, and I was terrified of what it might find. The minutes stretched into an eternity. I was a prisoner in the machine's noisy belly. Halfway through the procedure, a voice crackled through the intercom in my headphones, making me jump. "Mrs. Hayes, we're going to need to repeat that last series of images. Just try to stay as still as you can." My heart hammered against my ribs. Why? Why did they need to do it again? Did the machine malfunction? Or did they see something? Something so unclear, or so unbelievable, that they needed a second look. In that moment, the noisy tube felt like the most silent, lonely place on earth. The exam finally ended. I was given a plain manila envelope containing a CD with the images, and told that the radiologist's report would be sent to Dr. Aris within 48 hours. Those 2 days were a slow, agonizing crawl. We tried to maintain a facade of normalcy at home, but the tension was a physical presence. The CD sat on the kitchen counter like an unexploded bomb. Every time the phone rang, a jolt of pure adrenaline shot through me. The not knowing was a unique form of torture, a purgatory of terrifying possibilities. The second day came and went. No call. The silence from the doctor's office felt ominous, heavy with unspoken meaning. Had she seen the results? Was the news so bad that she was waiting for the right time to call? Or, in my darkest fear, had they once again found nothing, leaving me back at square one, now, with the neurologist's hope also extinguished? The waiting was no longer just anxious. It was unbearable, fraying the nerves of our entire family. That night, my third night of waiting, I went to bed early, exhausted by the sheer effort of being so afraid. Leo couldn't rest. I found out later that he sat in the kitchen for hours, just staring at the envelope on the counter. He was watching his mother disintegrate, and the answers were on that small plastic disc. He knew it was wrong, a violation of my privacy, but his protective desperation won out over his hesitation. He took the CD, went to his room, and slid it into his laptop. His hand was shaking as he clicked on the icon to open the image viewer. The software loaded, and a series of black and white cross-sectional images of my brain filled his screen. He scrolled through them, not a doctor, not knowing what to look for, just searching for something that looked wrong. And then he saw it. He stopped scrolling. In the upper right portion of the screen, there was a large, white, alien shape. It wasn't subtle. It was a glaring anomaly, a stark white mass against the textured gray of my brain tissue. It was clearly, unequivocally, something that was not supposed to be there. Leo clicked through more images, his breath catching in his throat. The shape wasn't just a spot. It was a mass. It was huge, almost perfectly round, and it was visibly compressing and distorting the normal structures of my brain. As a biology student, he didn't know the medical term for it, but he understood the terrifying implication of its size and location. The blood drained from his face. A roaring sound filled his ears. The image on the screen, the truth of my illness, was so monstrous, so much worse than anything he had imagined, that his body simply shut down. He tried to stand, but his legs gave way. He collapsed to the floor in a dead faint. The heavy thud of his body hitting the floor, followed by the clatter of his laptop falling off the bed, woke us instantly. Mark and I scrambled out of bed and ran to his room. We found him crumpled on the carpet, his eyes closed. My first thought was for him, a wave of maternal panic. Was he hurt? Was he sick? Mark knelt beside him, trying to rouse him. And that's when I saw it. The laptop lay open on the floor, its screen glowing in the dark room, and on that screen was an image of the inside of my head, an image containing a terrifying, impossibly large white mass. Mark helped a groggy, disoriented Leo to his feet as I, moving as if in a dream, picked up the laptop. I stared at the image. The world seemed to slow down, all sound fading away. There was no need for a medical degree. The thing in my brain was the size of a fist, a monstrous intruder. In that moment, there was no more fear of the unknown. The unknown was here, staring back at me from a computer screen. A strange, chilling calm washed over me. So that's what it was. I wasn't crazy. I was dying. And as Leo began to sob, my phone, sitting on my nightstand, began to ring. The caller ID read, Dr. Aris. My hand was shaking so badly, I could barely hold the phone. On the glowing laptop screen, a ghostly image of my own skull held the monstrous secret I had been carrying for 5 years. Through the speaker, I heard a calm, familiar voice. Alina, it's Dr. Aris. I am so sorry to call this late, but I just reviewed the radiologist's report. Are you with your family? I need you to sit down. Her voice was the anchor of reality in a world that had just tilted off its axis. She didn't waste time. She confirmed what my son had fainted from, what I was now staring at with a horrified fascination. You have a very large mass in your right frontal lobe. The characteristics on the scan are highly consistent with a I latched onto the word, turning it over in my mind. Meningioma. It sounded almost melodic, clinical, and clean, a stark contrast to the chaotic terror I felt. She explained that these tumors arise from the brain's protective lining and are usually, technically, benign. But the word benign was a cruel misnomer. Because of its size, Alina, she continued, her voice gentle but grave, it is incredibly dangerous. It has been growing for years, slowly compressing your brain. All of your symptoms, the fatigue, the fog, the headaches, the new neurological signs, this is why. The pressure it's exerting is immense. It was the most terrifying and validating paragraph of my life. I wasn't weak. I wasn't lazy. I wasn't depressed. I was being slowly crushed from the inside out. And then, the world began to move at a terrifying speed. I've already been on the phone with Dr. Benheim, she said. He's the chief of neurosurgery at University Hospital. He's seen your scans. He wants to see you and your family, first thing tomorrow morning. Alina, we need to move fast. The fog of the last 5 years was replaced by the dizzying velocity of a life-or-death crisis. My long, slow, lonely journey through the wilderness of the undiagnosed had just ended at the edge of a cliff. The next morning, we found ourselves in a part of the hospital that felt different. The air in the neurosurgery wing was quieter. The faces of the people in the waiting room etched with a deeper, more profound anxiety. Dr. Benheim was a man who seemed to operate at a different frequency, intense, focused, with no time for pleasantries. He clipped my scans onto a large light box on the wall, and the room was suddenly illuminated by the bright, terrifying image of my own brain. He pointed to the mass with the end of a pen. This, he said, his voice devoid of emotion, is a giant meningioma, likely grade 1, which means it's slow growing. But its size is the issue. It has displaced a significant portion of your frontal lobe. Frankly, I'm amazed you were functioning as well as you were. He then traced the areas around the tumor, explaining how it was pressing on the parts of my brain responsible for personality, executive function, and motor control. Your fatigue wasn't in your head. It was your brain screaming for energy. For the first time, I felt a strange and powerful connection to this blunt, unsentimental man. He wasn't talking about my feelings or my stress levels. He was talking about lobes and arteries and intracranial pressure. He was speaking the language of the physical truth I had known all along. Seeing him trace the cause of my suffering on that illuminated film was a profound, soul-shaking vindication. I looked at Mark and Leo, and I could see the same recognition in their eyes. We were finally in a place where the truth was real. Then he turned off the light box, and the room plunged back into a more somber reality. There is only one course of action here. We have to remove it. The surgery will be long, 8 to 10 hours, and it is complex. We are operating in the most valuable real estate in the universe. He looked at each of us in turn. I have to be clear about the risks. They include, but are not limited to, stroke, hemorrhage, infection, permanent neurological deficits like memory loss or paralysis, and death. We need to schedule you for the end of this week. The days leading up to the surgery were a blur of antiseptic smells and procedural conversations. I was poked and prodded, signing forms that listed my potential demise in sterile, legal language. The final night in the hospital was the quietest. My daughter Mia had flown in, and she, Leo, and Mark sat around my bed. We didn't talk much about the next day. We talked about old family vacations, about Leo's first day of kindergarten. We clung to the past because the future was a terrifying, formless void. After they had gone, I stayed up under the dim glow of the room's nightlight and wrote 3 letters, one to Mark, one to Leo, and one to Mia. How do you summarize a lifetime of love on a single piece of paper? How do you say goodbye, just in case? I wrote about my pride in my children, my gratitude for my husband. I told them to live fully, to be kind, to never take a single, clear-headed day for granted. Every word was a prayer, an apology for leaving, and a desperate hope that they would never have to read them. I was afraid, not of the pain, but of the oblivion. The fear of not waking up was a cold, heavy stone in my stomach. But even deeper than that was the fear of waking up as someone else, a version of me with my memories erased, my personality altered, my essence stolen by the surgeon's scalpel. I was fighting not just for my life, but for myself. As I finally drifted into a fitful sleep, I found a flicker of defiance. I had fought for 5 years to get to this battle. I was not going to surrender now. A nurse came in before dawn with a sedative that made my limbs feel heavy and my mind pleasantly fuzzy. "Time to go," she said softly. The last thing I saw as they wheeled me out of my room was my family's faces, a trinity of love and terror. I tried to give them a reassuring smile, but I'm not sure it worked. Then came the bright lights of the operating corridor. a transfer to a cold, narrow table, a mask over my face. I was told to count backward from 100. I remember saying 99, and then nothing. For my family, the nothing was filled with an agonizing, minute-by-minute awareness. They sat in the sterile waiting room, a small, terrified tribe. The coffee was bitter. The chairs were unforgiving. The television in the corner droned on, ignored. Mark paced. Leo tried to read a textbook, his eyes scanning the same page over and over. Mia scrolled endlessly through photos on her phone. They were suspended in time, trapped in a limbo where the only thing that mattered was happening behind a set of closed doors down the hall. The hours bled into one another. The 10-hour estimate came and went, then 11 hours, then 12. With each passing hour, the unspoken fear in the room grew louder. A delay in a surgery like this could only mean one thing: complications. The tumor was worse than they thought. It was wrapped around a critical artery. There was a bleed. Their imaginations, fueled by exhaustion and fear, conjured 1,000 terrible scenarios, each one more vivid and devastating than the last. The silence from the operating room was a scream. Finally, after nearly 13 hours, the door to the waiting room opened. Dr. Benheim stood there, still in his scrubs, his face masked by a surgical cap and a deep, profound exhaustion. He didn't speak as he walked slowly toward them. For my family, that short walk across the room was the longest journey of their lives. His expression was unreadable, a blank slate onto which they projected all their hopes and all their fears. They held their breath, braced for the impact of the words that would change their lives forever. He stopped in front of them and pulled down his mask. "We got it," he said, his voice raspy with fatigue. "We removed the entire thing." A collective, shuddering sigh of relief filled the room. Mia began to weep openly, but Dr. Benheim held up a hand. It was difficult. The tumor was heavily calcified and had adhered to the superior sagittal sinus major vein. The dissection was meticulous and slow. "She's stable, but she lost a lot of blood. The next 72 hours in the ICU will be critical. She is not out of the woods yet." My first sensation of consciousness was noise, the rhythmic whooshing sound of a ventilator breathing for me, the steady high-pitched beep of a heart monitor. I tried to open my eyes, but my lids felt like they were sealed with lead. The pain in my head was a white-hot, all-consuming universe. It wasn't a headache. It was a fundamental reordering of my entire being. I was pain. A blurry shape resolved itself at my bedside. It was Mark. His face was puffy, his eyes were red, and he was holding my hand. I was alive. The thought was not a joyful exclamation, but a simple, stunned realization. I had gone into the darkness, and I had come back. I tried to speak, to tell him I was here, but the breathing tube in my throat choked off any sound. Panic flared, hot and fast. I felt trapped, silenced. I squeezed his hand, pouring all of my fear and relief and love into that one small gesture. He squeezed back, his tears falling onto our joined hands. He understood. I was back. A nurse came over and spoke to me in a calm, soothing voice that cut through the fog of anesthetic. She explained where I was, what had happened. Then she began the tests. "Alina, can you hear me? Wiggle your toes." I sent the command, and I thought I felt a faint flicker in my feet. Could now squeeze my fingers. I squeezed with my right hand, the one Mark was holding. It felt strong. Okay. Now, the left. I focused all of my will, all of my concentration, on my left hand. I commanded it to close. Nothing happened. The days that followed were a landscape of small battles and incremental victories. After they removed the breathing tube, my first spoken word, "Hi," sounded like a stranger's rasp. A few days later, they moved me from the ICU to a regular room. A physical therapist came and announced we were going to try to stand up. The effort it took to simply swing my legs over the side of the bed and place my feet on the floor left me gasping, drenched in sweat. My left leg felt like it was made of wet sand. But with every grueling session, a piece of me came back. I graduated from standing to taking a single, shuffling step, then two. I spent an entire afternoon in occupational therapy, learning how to hold a fork again, my left hand refusing to cooperate. It was a humbling, often infuriating, process.